My mother-in-law slid a folded piece of paper across my kitchen table and told me she had already scheduled a DNA test for my 6-year-old son Eli because she did not believe he was my husband's child. She said it with a smile, the same smile she used at church when she complimented a dress she clearly hated. I remember staring at that paper for a long moment before I even understood what I was looking at. It was an appointment confirmation from a private lab 2 towns over, dated for the following Tuesday, with Eli's name already typed into the patient field. She had used my husband's name to make the booking, claiming to be his assistant, because she knew the receptionist would never have scheduled a minor's test without a parent's direct involvement otherwise. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a kind of disbelief that someone could plan this with my child's name typed into a form like he was a package to be inspected. My name is Hannah. I was 31 years old at the time, and I had been married to my husband Marcus for almost 8 years. We met in college, dated for 3 years before getting married, and Eli was born 2 years into our marriage after a pregnancy that nearly killed me from preeclampsia. Marcus held my hand through 11 hours of labor, and he was the first person besides the doctor to hold Eli, his face soaked in tears, whispering that he could not believe how much he already loved this tiny, screaming person. Marcus's mother, Diane, had never liked me, not from the very first dinner I had with their family. She used to introduce me to her friends as Marcus's girlfriend from the wrong side of town. Even after we were engaged, even after we were married, like the words wife or daughter-in-law physically hurt her to say. I grew up in a small rented house with my single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, and somehow that fact followed me into every room Diane ever stood in. Diane came from money, old money, the kind that built its own private school wing and had its name on a hospital donor plaque. She had wanted Marcus to marry a girl named Vanessa, the daughter of her best friend from the country club, a girl with a finance degree and a family trust fund that could buy 3 of the houses I grew up in. When Marcus chose me instead, Diane treated it less like her son falling in love and more like a personal insult she intended to correct eventually. For years I tried to win her over, bringing her favorite pastries to family dinners, remembering her birthday with thoughtful gifts, defending her to Marcus when he got frustrated with her comments. I told myself that time would soften her, that once she saw how happy Marcus and I were together, she would let go of whatever resentment she was holding on to. I was wrong about that, and I would learn exactly how wrong on the day she handed me that folded piece of paper. The trouble had actually started months earlier, though I did not see the full shape of it until much later. Diane began making small comments about Eli's appearance at family gatherings, comments disguised as harmless observations that somehow always managed to plant a seed of doubt. He has such different coloring than Marcus did as a baby, she would say, holding up old photographs, comparing them in front of everyone like she was building a case file in real time. At first I brushed it off as Diane being Diane, since she had spent 8 years finding ways to remind me I did not quite belong in her family. Marcus brushed it off too, telling me his mother had always been like this, hypercritical and cold, and that it had nothing to do with anything real. But the comments kept coming, growing sharper, more pointed, until they stopped sounding like idle observations and started sounding like accusations dressed up in soft language. Eli has curly auburn hair and green eyes, while Marcus has straight dark hair and brown eyes, and I have wavy light brown hair with hazel eyes. My own grandfather, who I never met because he died before I was born, had red hair and green eyes according to every photograph my mother kept of him in an old shoebox. Genetics does not work in straight, predictable lines, but Diane was not interested in genetics. She was interested in a narrative that let her finally have the leverage she had been hunting for since the day Marcus proposed to me. The breaking point, the moment that pushed her from passive comments into active sabotage, happened at Marcus's father's 70th birthday party 6 weeks before the DNA test appointment. Diane stood up during the toasts, glass in hand, and told a story about how Eli must have gotten his coloring from somewhere interesting, looking directly at me as she said it, while half the extended family chuckled awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. Marcus's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle working beneath his skin, but he said nothing in front of his father's guests, choosing instead to address it privately later, which I understood, but which also left the comment hanging in the air like smoke that never quite cleared. That night in the car on the way home, I asked Marcus directly if he had ever doubted that Eli was his son. He pulled the car over, turned to me, and said the words I needed to hear, that he had never doubted it for a single second, that he remembered exactly when Eli was conceived because it was the weekend of our anniversary trip to the lake house, 2 years into our marriage, just the 2 of us. He told me his mother's comments said more about her need for control than about any actual doubt, and I believed him because I trusted him completely, but I also knew Diane well enough to know she was not finished. What I did not know was that Diane had hired a private investigator 3 months earlier, a man named Roy Bennett, who specialized in what he called family verification services, which was a polite way of saying he dug up dirt for wealthy clients who wanted ammunition against people they did not like. Roy had been quietly photographing my comings and goings, my workplace, even a few of my old friends from college, trying to construct a timeline that might support Diane's theory that Eli was not Marcus's biological child. I learned about Roy's existence only after everything fell apart, when his own conscience, or perhaps his own self-preservation instinct, made him hand over records that would later matter more than Diane could have ever imagined. The Tuesday of the scheduled DNA test arrived faster than I expected, and Diane showed up at our house unannounced that morning, dressed like she was attending a courtroom hearing rather than a family visit. She told Marcus and me, standing in our own living room, that she had already paid for the test, already scheduled it, and that she expected us to bring Eli in for a simple cheek swab that afternoon. "If there's nothing to hide, this should be easy," she said, looking directly at me with an expression that made my stomach turn cold. Marcus, to his credit, was furious in a way I had rarely seen him before, his voice low and controlled but absolutely unmoving as he told his mother that she had no right to question his son's parentage, no right to schedule any test without our consent, and no right to use his name to do it. "You used my name on a medical appointment without telling me," he said, his voice cracking slightly with disbelief. "Do you understand how insane that is?" Diane did not back down, instead crossing her arms and saying that someone needed to protect this family's interests, especially with the trust fund Marcus's father had set up for Eli, a trust fund that required proof of biological lineage according to a clause she had apparently had her lawyer review months earlier. That detail landed like a punch to my chest, because I had not known about any such clause, and Marcus admitted, looking pale, that he had also forgotten about it, since the trust had been established when Eli was a newborn and none of us had thought about its specific terms since. Diane explained, almost gleefully, that the trust required a DNA verification before any funds could be released to Eli at age 18. A clause she said her late father-in-law had insisted on decades ago to prevent fraudulent claims within the family, though it had never once been enforced or even mentioned since it was written. She said she was simply being responsible, getting ahead of a requirement that would come up eventually anyway, but the way she said it, with that same tight little smile, made it obvious this was not about responsibility at all. I told her, as calmly as I could manage while my entire body trembled with anger, that we would handle the trust paperwork on our own timeline through our own lawyer, and that she had no business inserting herself into our son's medical decisions. Diane's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered it, and she said something that I will never forget for as long as I live. "I just want to know the truth before this family gives away millions of dollars to a child who might not even share our blood." The word "our" hung in the room like a slap, because it made it clear this was never about Marcus's wishes or even concern for the trust. It was about Diane deciding who counted as family and who did not, based on her own narrow definitions of blood and worthiness. Marcus asked his mother to leave, his voice shaking now, and Diane left without another word, but not before glancing at Eli, who had wandered in from the hallway clutching his stuffed dinosaur, confusion written across his small face at the tension filling the room. That night, after we put Eli to bed, Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table and made a decision that would change everything that followed. We decided to take the DNA test ourselves, not because we had any doubt, but because we wanted to control the process, choose the lab, and make sure the results existed on our own terms rather than Diane's. Marcus called his mother the next morning and told her in a tone that left no room for argument that we would handle the test privately, through our own family doctor, and that she would receive the results only if and when we chose to share them. Diane agreed to this with surprising ease, which should have made me suspicious at the time, but I was too consumed with anger and hurt to think clearly about her motives. What I did not know then, but learned weeks later, was that Diane had already arranged something far more dangerous behind the scenes, something that went beyond a simple DNA test and straight into territory that could have destroyed our family permanently. She had been quietly meeting with a lawyer named Gerald Hoffman, an old family friend who specialized in trust and estate law, discussing how she might challenge Eli's standing in the family trust regardless of what any DNA test eventually showed. Her plan, as I would later discover through documents Marcus's father accidentally found in his home office, was to use any uncertainty, any delay, any drama surrounding the test as leverage to push for Eli's removal from the trust entirely, redirecting those funds toward Marcus's younger sister's children instead. Marcus's younger sister, Patricia, had 2 children with her husband, a man named Jeff who worked in real estate and who Diane adored in a way she had never once extended to me. Diane had always favored Patricia, even when we were younger, something Marcus had told me about during our dating years, describing how his mother lit up around his sister in a way she never did with him. I had assumed that favoritism was simply a family quirk, something uncomfortable but ultimately harmless, never imagining it could evolve into a calculated scheme to redirect a college trust fund away from her own grandson. We took Eli to our family doctor, a woman named Dr. Alvarez who had known our family for years, and she performed a simple, painless cheek swab while Eli giggled, thinking it was some kind of game. The samples were sent to an accredited lab, and we were told results would take approximately 2 weeks, which felt like the longest 2 weeks of my entire life. Every day that passed, I caught myself staring at Eli's face during breakfast, searching for traces of Marcus in his features, even though I knew with absolute certainty there was nothing to find because I had never once been unfaithful in our marriage. During those 2 weeks, Diane did not stay quiet despite agreeing to let us handle things privately. She began calling extended family members, dropping hints about concerns within the marriage, framing herself as a worried grandmother simply trying to protect her grandson's inheritance from potential complications. My sister-in-law Patricia called me one evening, her voice tight with discomfort, to tell me that Diane had been talking to their book club friends about the situation, embellishing details, suggesting that I had been evasive about agreeing to the test, which was a complete fabrication since I had agreed to a test from the very beginning, just not on Diane's terms. The rumor spread faster than I could have imagined, reaching even my own workplace through a strange chain of acquaintances, until I found myself fielding uncomfortable questions from a coworker who had heard something about a paternity dispute through her cousin who happened to attend the same church as Diane. I felt like I was drowning in a narrative I had no control over, watching my reputation and my marriage become public conversation fodder for people who had no idea what was actually happening inside our home. Marcus was equally furious, calling his mother repeatedly, demanding she stop spreading rumors, but Diane simply denied saying anything inappropriate, insisting she was only sharing her concerns with people who cared about the family. 3 days before the test results were due, something happened that shifted the entire situation in a direction none of us expected. Roy Bennett, the private investigator Diane had hired months earlier, showed up at our front door unannounced, looking nervous, clutching a manila folder against his chest like it might burn him if he let go. He told us he needed to speak with us, that he had been hired by Diane to investigate me, and that he could no longer in good conscience continue working for her given what he had uncovered. We invited him inside, both of us stunned into a kind of numb silence, and he laid out the manila folder on our kitchen table, the same table where Diane had once placed her DNA test confirmation. Inside were months of surveillance photos, financial records pulled from public databases, and notes detailing Roy's attempts to find any evidence of infidelity on my part during the time frame of Eli's conception. He had found nothing, he told us, because there was nothing to find, but Diane had pushed him to keep digging, growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to produce the evidence she wanted. What truly disturbed Roy, he explained, was a conversation he overheard during one of his meetings with Diane, where she discussed her plan with her lawyer to challenge Eli's trust eligibility regardless of the DNA results, using any ambiguity or delay as justification to redirect the funds toward Patricia's children. He had recorded part of that conversation on his phone, he admitted, not for any noble reason but because he had started worrying about his own legal exposure if Diane's scheme ever became public and he was implicated in it. He played us a 30-second clip, Diane's voice unmistakable, saying that even if the test came back proving Eli was Marcus's son, she intended to argue that biological proof isn't the same as character proof when it came to determining who deserved access to the family's money. I sat there listening to my mother-in-law's voice plotting to steal my son's inheritance regardless of the truth, and something inside me went very still and very clear. Marcus looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of those 30 seconds, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Roy apologized repeatedly, explaining that he was leaving Diane's employment immediately and giving us copies of everything he had gathered, including detailed notes on every conversation, every payment, every plan Diane had discussed with her lawyer over the past several months. That night after Roy left, Marcus and I sat in stunned silence for a long time before either of us spoke. "She was never going to stop," Marcus finally said, his voice hollow. "Even if the test proved Eli was mine, she was still going to try to take this from him." I realized in that moment that this had never really been about doubting my fidelity at all. It had been about money, about favoritism, about Diane finding any excuse, however flimsy, to redirect resources toward the grandchildren she had always preferred. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by email from Dr. Alvarez's office with a simple subject line that made my heart stop for a moment before I even opened it. Marcus and I sat together at the kitchen table, his hand wrapped tightly around mine as he clicked open the attachment. The results showed a 99.99% probability of paternity, confirming with absolute scientific certainty what we had known all along, that Eli was completely, unquestionably Marcus's biological son. I cried not from surprise, but from the exhausting relief of finally having undeniable proof to throw back at every doubting glance and whispered rumor Diane had spread over the past several weeks. Marcus printed the results immediately, his expression hardening into something I had never quite seen on his face before, a calm and deliberate resolve that told me he was done being patient with his mother. "We're going to deal with this properly," he said. "Not just the test, all of it." The following weekend, Marcus called a family meeting at his parents' house, inviting his father, his mother, and his sister Patricia, telling them only that he had important news to share regarding Eli's paternity test. Diane arrived looking smug, clearly assuming the meeting was simply a formality to confirm what she likely suspected all along, that the results would prove Eli was Marcus's son, and that she would graciously accept this outcome while quietly moving forward with her other plans. What she did not know was that we had brought more than just the test results with us that day. We sat in the formal living room Diane reserved for guests she wanted to impress, the same room where I had once nervously met Marcus's parents for the first time 8 years earlier. Marcus's father, a quiet, reserved man named Richard who rarely involved himself in family conflicts, sat near the window, looking uncomfortable but present, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Patricia sat beside her mother, fidgeting with her wedding ring, clearly uneasy about whatever tension had brought everyone together on a Sunday afternoon instead of the usual casual family dinner. Marcus began by placing the DNA test results on the coffee table, sliding them toward his mother, watching her face carefully as she read the 99.99% confirmation. Diane's expression shifted briefly, something like relief flickering across her features before she quickly composed herself into a more neutral expression, saying something about how glad she was that we finally have clarity. "We do have clarity," Marcus said, his voice steady, "but not just about the test." He then placed the manila folder Roy had given us on the table next to the test results, and I watched the color drain from Diane's face as she recognized exactly what it was. Marcus explained, calmly and methodically, everything Roy Bennett had told us: the surveillance, the months of digging for evidence of infidelity that never existed, and most importantly, the recorded conversation where Diane revealed her plan to challenge Eli's trust eligibility regardless of what the DNA test showed. "You were never trying to find the truth," Marcus said, his voice finally breaking with the emotion he had been holding back. "You already decided what conclusion you wanted, and you were building a case to get there no matter what the facts actually said." Richard, who had remained silent until this point, asked Diane directly if this was true, if she had truly hired an investigator to surveil her own daughter-in-law and had discussed redirecting Eli's trust funds toward Patricia's children regardless of the test results. Diane's composure finally cracked, and she began stammering about protecting the family's interests, about ensuring the trust was given to children who would appreciate it properly, language that made it clear even now she still saw Eli as somehow less deserving despite the irrefutable proof in front of her. Patricia, to her credit, looked horrified, turning to her mother and asking if she had really tried to take money away from her own nephew to give to her children without even discussing it with her first. "I never asked for this," Patricia said quietly, her voice trembling. I never wanted you to take anything away from Eli. He's my nephew. I love him. Diane tried to backpedal, claiming she only wanted to make sure the money was properly protected. But the recording Roy had captured left no room for ambiguity about her actual intentions, and everyone in that room had now heard her own voice confirming the plan in her own words. Richard, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him, asked Marcus and me to give him a moment alone with Diane, and we stepped outside onto the back porch with Patricia, the three of us standing in heavy silence as muffled voices rose and fell behind the closed door. What happened in that conversation between Richard and Diane, I never learned every detail of, but the consequences became clear over the following weeks. Richard, it turned out, had been the one who originally insisted on the trust's strict terms decades earlier, not out of any suspicion toward future grandchildren, but as a general safeguard against fraud that he had never intended to be weaponized against his own family members. Learning that his wife had twisted his original intentions into a tool for excluding his own grandson based on nothing but petty favoritism apparently broke something in him that had been quietly fracturing for years. 3 weeks after that family meeting, Richard filed paperwork to restructure the family trust entirely, removing Diane as a co-trustee, a position she had held since the trust's creation, and placing the oversight solely under his own control along with a neutral third-party financial advisor. He also amended the verification clause that had started this entire ordeal, removing the DNA requirement altogether and replacing it with simple birth certificate documentation, explaining to us privately that he never wanted another grandchild to go through what Eli's parents had just endured because of a clause meant to prevent fraud that had instead become a weapon for cruelty. Diane fought the restructuring initially, hiring her own lawyer to challenge Richard's authority over the trust, but the recorded conversation Roy had captured became powerful evidence when Richard's lawyer reviewed it, since it clearly demonstrated an intent to manipulate trust distributions based on personal favoritism rather than any legitimate concern. The legal battle never made it to a courtroom, mostly because Diane's own lawyer advised her that fighting this publicly risked exposing the recording and the surveillance investigation to a level of scrutiny that could create far more damage than simply accepting Richard's restructuring. Diane ultimately backed down, signing the new trust documents quietly, though I knew from Marcus's tense phone calls with her afterward that she remained bitter, framing herself as the victim of an overreaction rather than acknowledging what she had actually tried to do. Marcus, for the first time in our marriage, drew a firm boundary with his mother, telling her that until she could apologize sincerely, not just to him but directly to me and eventually to Eli when he was old enough to understand, she would not be welcome at our home or around our son without supervision. The months that followed were difficult in ways I had not anticipated, not because of any lingering doubt about Eli's parentage, but because of the strange grief of watching a family relationship fracture so completely after years of trying to hold it together. Marcus struggled with guilt, feeling responsible for not standing up to his mother sooner, for the years of small comments he had brushed off as harmless that had clearly been building towards something far more damaging all along. I struggled too, replaying every dinner, every holiday, every moment I had spent trying to win Diane's approval, realizing now how much energy I had wasted trying to please someone who had decided long before Eli was even born that I would never truly belong in her family. Patricia, surprisingly, became one of my closest allies during this period, reaching out more often, inviting Eli and her own children for playdates, making a clear and deliberate effort to show that she did not share her mother's views. She told me one afternoon while our kids played in her backyard that she had always felt uncomfortable with how her mother treated me, but had never found the courage to speak up, afraid of becoming Diane's next target if she pushed back too hard. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner," she told me, her eyes wet with tears. "You deserved better from this family from the very beginning." Roy Bennett, the investigator who had ultimately chosen conscience over continued employment, sent us one final message a few months later, letting us know that Diane had attempted to hire another investigator to dig further into our finances, presumably searching for some other angle to challenge the trust restructuring, but that the new investigator, having heard about the recorded conversation through industry circles, had refused to take the job. It seemed Diane's reputation within certain professional circles had taken a quiet hit, word of her methods apparently spreading enough that she found it increasingly difficult to find anyone willing to help her continue what had become an obsessive campaign against her own grandson's inheritance. Richard eventually told Marcus, during a rare moment of vulnerability between father and son, that he felt he had failed to protect his family from his wife's worst instincts for far too long, and that watching the DNA test ordeal unfold had finally given him the clarity and courage to make changes he should have made years earlier. What none of us expected was that Diane would make one final attempt to reclaim control before she ever offered anything resembling an apology, and it came in a form none of us saw coming. A letter arrived at our house in early December, addressed to Marcus and me jointly, written on Diane's personal stationery, the kind with her initials embossed at the top in gold lettering. Inside, she did not apologize. She instead proposed what she called a compromise, suggesting that Eli's trust be split evenly between him and Patricia's 2 children, framing it as a fair solution that would supposedly restore peace within the family. Marcus read the letter twice, his expression darkening with each line before sliding it across the table to me without a word. I read it slowly, struck by how Diane had managed to make herself sound reasonable, even generous, while still trying to claw back a portion of what Richard had already legally settled months earlier. There was no mention of the surveillance, no mention of the recorded conversation, no mention of the months of rumors she had spread through her church and book club friends, only a calm, polished paragraph suggesting that everyone deserves a fair share. Marcus called Richard immediately, reading the letter aloud over the phone, and I could hear his father's heavy sigh through the speaker before he even responded. Richard told us he would handle it, and 2 days later he sat down with Diane alone in his study, the same room where he had once told us he restructured the trust to protect Eli from exactly this kind of maneuvering. He later told Marcus that he had simply reminded Diane that the trust documents were final, that any further attempts to challenge them publicly would require revisiting the recorded conversation in a legal context, and that he was no longer willing to shield her from the consequences of her own choices. Diane did not send another letter after that, but the silence that followed felt different from the silence after our first confrontation, heavier somehow, as if she had finally understood that the ground beneath her had genuinely shifted and would not be shifting back. Patricia, when she heard about the letter, was furious in a way I had never seen from her before, calling her mother directly and telling her she wanted absolutely nothing to do with any scheme that pulled money away from Eli to benefit her own children. "Don't you dare use my kids as an excuse for this," Patricia told her mother, her voice loud enough that I could hear it through the phone speaker when she called me afterward, still shaking with anger. "I won't let you turn my children into the reason you keep hurting this family." That conversation seemed to mark a real turning point for Patricia, who began distancing herself from Diane in ways that went beyond simple loyalty to Marcus and me. She started bringing her kids to our house more frequently, not just for scheduled visits but for spontaneous Saturday afternoons, the kind of easy, unplanned closeness that had never really existed between our families before everything happened. Watching my son and his cousins grow closer, running through our backyard together while Patricia and I sat on the porch with coffee, felt like its own quiet form of justice, a family rebuilding itself in the exact places Diane had once tried to create division. Christmas that year was tense in a different way than usual, since Diane attended Richard's annual holiday dinner but sat mostly in silence, picking at her food, clearly uncomfortable with how the dynamics around her had shifted so completely. Eli, unaware of any of the underlying tension, ran up to her at one point during the evening, excitedly showing her a drawing he had made at school, and I watched Diane's face soften for just a moment, something flickering behind her eyes that looked almost like regret. She complimented his drawing carefully, gently, in a tone I had not heard her use with him before, and for the first time in a long while I let myself wonder if some small part of her was beginning to understand what she had nearly destroyed. It was not enough to undo the damage, not nearly enough, but it was a small crack in the wall, the same kind of crack that would eventually widen into the coffee shop conversation months later, where she finally offered something resembling genuine accountability. Marcus and I talked often during those months about what forgiveness, if it ever came, would actually look like, agreeing that it could never simply mean returning to how things were before, since the trust between us had been broken in a way that required real, sustained change rather than a single tearful conversation. We decided together that any future relationship with Diane would happen entirely on our terms, with clear boundaries around how she spoke about me, how she treated Eli, and how involved she would ever be allowed to be in decisions about our son's life and future. Dr. Alvarez, our family doctor, told us during Eli's next checkup that she had heard secondhand through a mutual acquaintance about the trust dispute, and she gently mentioned that she had seen this kind of family conflict before, more often than people might expect, especially in families where money and inheritance created pressure points that exposed resentments which had been simmering for years. She recommended a family therapist, a woman named Dr. Akafer, who specialized in family systems and intergenerational conflict, and Marcus and I began attending sessions together, working through not just the immediate fallout from Diane's scheme but the years of smaller hurts that had led us to this point. Those sessions helped Marcus understand his own patterns of avoidance, the years he had spent minimizing his mother's behavior rather than confronting it directly, and they helped me understand that my constant efforts to win Diane's approval had often come at the cost of advocating clearly for myself within the marriage. By the time spring arrived, something in our household had genuinely settled, not into the family we had once imagined we would have, but into something steadier and more honest than what existed before. Marcus began setting firmer boundaries not just with his mother but in other areas of his life where he had historically avoided conflict, telling me one evening that the entire ordeal had taught him the cost of staying silent simply to keep the peace. I found myself, for the first time in years, no longer anxious before family gatherings, no longer rehearsing conversations in my head trying to anticipate Diane's next pointed comment, simply because I had finally accepted that her approval was never something I needed in order to feel secure in my own family. Marcus agreed cautiously, bringing me along despite Diane's initial hesitation, telling her firmly that any conversation about moving forward needed to include me, since I was the one she had spent years undermining and the one she had ultimately accused of infidelity without any evidence. We met at a quiet coffee shop, neutral territory, and Diane, looking smaller and more uncertain than I had ever seen her, finally offered something resembling a real apology, acknowledging that her obsession with the trust and her resentment toward me had clouded her judgment in ways she was only now beginning to understand. She admitted, with what seemed like genuine difficulty, that she had always seen me as an outsider who had taken her son away from the life she had envisioned for him, and that this resentment had festered for years until it finally exploded into the DNA test scheme. She did not fully excuse her behavior, but she acknowledged the surveillance, the rumors, the trust manipulation, all of it, in a way that felt more honest than anything she had said to us in the 8 years I had known her. It was not a perfect resolution, and our relationship has never fully healed back to anything resembling warmth, but it was a starting point, a small crack of accountability in a wall that had stood between us since the very beginning of my relationship with Marcus. Eli, now 7 years old, knows nothing of the DNA test or the trust dispute or any of the ugliness that happened around him during those difficult months, and Marcus and I have agreed that he never needs to know the details until he is old enough to understand the complexity of adult relationships and family dysfunction. What he does know is that his grandmother visits less often now, that his Aunt Patricia comes around much more, and that his parents seem to laugh more easily together since that strange period when the house always felt tense for reasons he could not quite name. He still has his curly auburn hair, his bright green eyes, features that came from a great-grandfather he will never meet, features that nearly tore our family apart simply because someone decided to see suspicion where there was only ever love. Looking back now, I think about how close Diane came to fracturing our entire family over resemblance, over old money and older grudges, over a trust fund clause written decades before Eli was even born. I think about how the truth, when it finally came out, did not just vindicate me. It exposed something much deeper and much darker about the lengths a person will go to protect their own narrow definition of who deserves to be loved and provided for within a family. And I think about Eli, blissfully unaware of the storm that once raged around him, growing up surrounded now by people who chose, eventually, to fight for him rather than against him, which in the end was the only outcome that ever truly mattered. Patricia's husband Jeff, who had mostly stayed out of the family drama until that point, surprised everyone by reaching out to Marcus directly one afternoon, asking if they could grab coffee, just the two of them. Marcus told me afterward that Jeff had apologized on behalf of his own silence, admitting that he had heard Diane discussing her plans for the trust on more than one occasion at family gatherings, and had never said anything because he assumed it was simply idle talk that would never actually go anywhere. "I should have warned you," Jeff told Marcus, staring into his coffee cup. "I heard her talking about Eli's trust like it was already decided, and I just let it go because I didn't want to get in the middle of it." That conversation mattered more than Jeff probably realized, because it confirmed something Marcus and I had begun to suspect, that Diane's scheme had not been some sudden impulsive decision born out of a single moment of jealousy, but a plan she had been quietly discussing and refining for a long time before she ever handed me that folded appointment confirmation. It also told us that other people in the family had noticed the warning signs and had simply chosen silence, the same kind of silence Marcus himself had practiced for years, the silence that allows dysfunction to keep growing in the dark until it finally breaks out into the open. Marcus thanked Jeff for finally speaking up, and the two of them, who had never been particularly close before, found themselves building an unexpected friendship in the months that followed, bonded by a shared frustration with how long everyone had let Diane's behavior go unchecked. As the one-year anniversary of the original DNA test confrontation approached, Marcus and I sat down one evening and talked about how far we had come since that day Diane slid the appointment confirmation across our kitchen table. We had survived months of rumors, a private investigation, a trust restructuring, a tense holiday season, and countless hours of therapy. And somehow through all of it, our marriage had not just survived but had grown stronger in ways neither of us expected. "I used to think loving my mother meant accepting whatever she did," Marcus told me that night, his voice quiet and reflective. "I know now that real love sometimes means telling someone the truth, even when it costs you the relationship you thought you wanted." Eli's 7th birthday party that year was the first major family gathering since everything had settled, and Diane attended, bringing a carefully chosen gift, behaving with a kind of careful restraint that felt almost unfamiliar coming from her. She sat near the edge of the backyard for most of the party, watching from a distance as Eli ran around with his cousins and friends, occasionally catching my eye and offering a small, uncertain smile that I still was not sure how to interpret. At one point, she approached me near the drink table and in a low voice told me that she had been seeing a therapist of her own, something I never expected to hear from a woman who had spent years insisting that therapy was for people who couldn't handle their own problems. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said, looking down at her hands rather than at me directly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to understand why I did what I did. It wasn't really about Eli." I think it was never really about Eli at all. I did not have a perfect response for her in that moment, and I am not sure one existed, so I simply told her that I appreciated her honesty and that actions over time would matter more to me than any single conversation ever could. She nodded, seeming to accept that answer, and walked back toward Richard, who placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, the two of them watching together as their grandson blew out 7 candles surrounded by people who had fought in their own different ways to make sure he never had to know how close he came to losing more than he ever should have. Looking back on that entire year, from the folded paper on my kitchen table to the quiet conversation by the drink table at Eli's birthday party, I understand now that the DNA test was never really the center of the story at all. It was simply the spark that finally forced years of buried resentment, favoritism, and unspoken grievances into the light, where they could finally be examined, confronted, and in some cases slowly repaired. Diane's attempt to destroy my credibility and steal my son's inheritance ended up dismantling the very foundation of control she had built her identity around for decades, and in its place, something more honest, if imperfect, slowly began to grow. Marcus and I still have hard conversations about his mother from time to time, and I do not know if our relationship with her will ever fully heal into something warm and uncomplicated, but I have stopped needing that outcome in order to feel whole. What I always needed, was for my husband to stand beside me when it mattered most, for the truth to finally be spoken out loud in a room full of people who had spent too long avoiding it, and for my son to grow up surrounded by people who chose, eventually, to fight for him rather than against him. A few weeks after the birthday party, Dr. Ackafer asked Marcus and me during one of our final scheduled sessions what we had each learned from the entire ordeal, and I found myself answering before I had even fully thought through the words. I told her that I had learned the difference between earning love and simply existing within it, that for years I had treated Diane's approval as something I needed to chase, when in reality the people who truly loved me, Marcus, Eli, even Patricia in her own quiet way, had never required me to prove myself at all. Marcus added that he had learned the cost of silence within families, how avoiding conflict to keep an uneasy peace often allows real harm to keep growing unnoticed. And he promised both Dr. Akaffer and me that he would never again let his mother's comfort take priority over his own family's safety and dignity. The DNA test that was supposed to destroy my marriage and steal my son's future ended up doing the exact opposite, stripping away the polite fictions Diane had hidden behind for years and revealing the truth not just about Eli's parentage, but about who in that family was actually willing to stand up for what was right. It cost Diane her position in the trust, her credibility among her own family, and years of relationships she had spent decades cultivating, all because she could not accept that love and belonging are not things measured by blood resemblance or financial inheritance, but by the people who show up again and again for the family they choose to protect. In the end, the results that were meant to destroy me destroyed her instead, and our family, smaller and more honest now, finally found a kind of peace that had been missing from the very beginning.